Okay, everyone, we'll, if you wouldn't mind taking your seat, those loitering at the back. We are expecting a few more people to come. If you wouldn't mind sliding along the pew a little bit so that people can join us easily on the edge, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. That was quite dramatic at the front, everyone moving across. My name's Professor Martin Hook. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Urban Design. You can normally recognise deans because they're the only ones in academia who wear ties, and they're the ones who are wandering around taking all the posters of out-of-date events off the walls. This evening, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to traditional owners both past, present and future. And RMIT respectfully acknowledges their contribution to this place. This evening I'm delighted to introduce the annual MoDDD public lecture. For those of you who don't know, the MoDDD is the Master of Design Development and Disaster, and is a young and dynamic master's program that effectively is the only program in the Southeast Asian region that prefaces design as a key component of engaging with disaster relief, but also looking to facilitate development. I think that's a very critical part of what it is that we do here. And in the School of Architecture and Urban Design, we're very proud to host that activity that Professor Esther Charlesworth and Dr. Judy Rogers drive and run, along with an ever-increasing number of students and particularly enthusiastic students. The program is delivered in a way that it actually engages very real situations, and it's deeply embedded with industry, the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, World Vision, and really beginning to look at the ways in which we engage positively with this notion of how design might proactively contribute to solutions through conditions that are brought about through climate change, certainly increasingly through disasters, both natural, if there is such a thing, and man-made. And particularly for this evening's lecture, the focus on the massive population shift that occurs as a consequence of some of these things. It wouldn't be right if I didn't do a blatant plug for the program and show you a short video that explains in some more detail the things that we do and what really are the drivers and concerns in the ways in which we engage with students in the program. I hope you enjoyed this evening. Professor Esther Charlesworth will take the stand after the video, and then we'll move quickly on to the real reason we're here, and that is to listen to our speakers this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the third MoDDD annual public lecture. And thank you to Martin Hook, our Dean, and to the incredible support that he has given to MoDDD staff and students since he's been our Dean in the last 12 months. So before introducing our three very eminent speakers tonight, an observation that I've made in the last couple of weeks is that there are many well-known that there are many well-known entities in the entertainment field, from Ai Weiwei to Kate Blanchett, currently voicing their opinions on the refugee sphere and on the theme of tonight's lecture, the global refugee crisis. However, Tim Costello, Paris Aristotle and Brett Moore have committed their lives and work in dealing with the sticky problems of our time, particularly the seemingly intractable crisis from Christmas Island Cox's Bazar. And this is why they're invited here tonight for the third MoDDD public lecture, not so much to offer solutions, but explore the ethical and logistical conundrum of having more than 68 million people now displaced globally without food, water and shelter. So I'm going to quickly run through the three speakers and then ask them one by one to come up and talk. Our first speaker will be known to many of you here. Tim Costello joined World Vision, where he served as CEO from 2004 to 2016 and now serves as Chief Advocate of the organisation. Prior to joining World Vision Australia, Tim served as Minister at the Collins Street Baptist Church in Melbourne and is Executive Director of Urban Seed, a Christian not-for-profit outreach service for the urban poor. Amongst many other things, Tim currently serves as Chair on the Community Council of Australia, the Australian Churches Gambling Task Force, and the National Australia Bank Social Responsibility Advisory Council, and he's a well-known figure to the mod community. Our second speaker, Paris Aristotle, is the CEO of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. Paris has nearly 30 years' experience in the field of supporting refugees and asylum seekers, particularly the provision of services to survivors of torture and trauma. Throughout this period, he's worked closely with UNHCR in the field of refugee resettlement and served on a wide range of state and federal government bodies advising on refugee and asylum seeker policy and multicultural affairs. Our third and final speaker, Brett Moore, is an architect who for 20 years has worked in the field of humanitarian aid and development. From South Sudan to Sri Lanka, Philippines, Brett has been everywhere. Brett was more recently based in Australia with World Vision International until taking up a couple of years ago the prestigious Loeb Fellowship at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Brett is now the Chief of Shelter and Settlements for UNHCR, where he is unofficially the world's largest urban designer. Responsible for camp planning, housing infrastructure for more than 3,700,000 people now living in 225 planned and managed camps such as Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. People there who have fled their homeland because of conflict or persecution. Brett has also worked with the MoDDD team over the last 5 or 6 years in developing the degree and will shortly be appointed as an adjunct professor in MoDDD. Before I ask Tim to come to the podium to kickstart this event, may I just ask you all to turn off your devices or Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is that you're logged into. And just to say, this lecture will be videotaped, and if anybody has a problem with being photographed or videotaped, then maybe think of somewhere else to sit. But with no further ado, I welcome Tim Costello to the lectern. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you for being out here tonight to give up your time for a morally serious issues I don't take lightly, and time is all we have in life. That's why when someone wastes our time, they're sort of a thief, and we choose to actually invest our time, hopefully, in things that both leave a legacy in ourselves and in terms of the world being a better place. So that's the thanks I give to you for coming and giving your time. So I want to address this question of why Australians should actually even care about the refugee crisis. I get at a certain level why people don't care. When you're bombarded with news of horrors around the world, suffering from Asia to Africa, particularly the Syria and the Middle East, Yemen, Myanmar, South Sudan, and I've just come back from there where 2.5 million and a population of about 10 million have fled, 1 million into Uganda in the north alone. It's easy to be overwhelmed, and you just sense that it's too big, it's too complex, it doesn't directly impact on me. I might have some empathetic views, but really I'm struggling to make sense of the little bubble in which I live my life, and that's all overwhelming. I absolutely get that. I get it particularly with Australians. There's no question that as the only continent on earth surrounded by a sea, we particularly feel this isn't our responsibility. And we have been shaped by that sense of a natural barrier and the fact that we're off Broadway, we're only really on the way to Antarctica and who goes there. So, refugees, not really our problem, they're someone else's problem. So really, when the question is posed, why should we care? It's a question that goes to our humanity. I think the defining feature of being human, there are probably many features, but one of the defining features is this. We empathise with others. We imagine what it would be like to have been in their shoes. When empathy is shut down, I think humanity is shut down. When empathy is opened up and we can get overwhelmed and we need to not suffer burnout and collapse or think we're the Messiah and can solve it all, but when empathy is opened up, we are more fully human. I think that's right at the heart of the answer to why we should care. Ethics, at the end of the day, is really just the struggle to think about the world as it is and the world as it could be or should be. And if you're going to try and think about your part in answering the question, the world as it could be and should be, empathy is really the trapdoor you've got to spring open to think about those questions. Well, when we care about people, and I could give religious answers or philosophical answers to say we learn ethics and empathy, seeing someone homeless, someone a fellow citizen suffering bushfire or drought, but we often then put a circle, a perimeter around that empathy and say, well, that's a clear ethical duty. They're a fellow Aussie. The next question of, does someone who's homeless beyond these shores actually have an ethical claim on me? Or does ethics actually stop with national borders? I raise that because if I had $1 for every time Australians say to me, Tim, we've got homeless here, we should just look after our own problems, forget talking to us about aid. Rumours, you'll be in the Sydney Morning Herald tomorrow, that in this budget there's going to be another aid cut. We're at the lowest ever in our history, 0.22% of gross national income, that's 22 cents and $100. Highest under Menzies at 50 cents, aid was always bipartisan. 11 billion cut out of aid over 4 years by the Hockey Abbott budget. And if you're going to fund 65 billion for tax cuts for corporates, it's got to come from somewhere, right? And those who don't vote are those, because they're recipients offshore, who are the easiest to use as the ATM. But people say to me, well, we should just look after our own. Two comments. Firstly, I don't think ethics stops at national borders. If human rights are universal and indivisible, by definition, we actually say those people who are beyond our borders do have an ethical claim on us. We can't do everything, but they have an ethical claim. Secondly, I've found, almost without exception, that the people who say loudest we should just look after our own at home usually are the people doing least for those here at home. I ran domestic charities for 20 years, so I've got pretty good radar about this. My explanation is that's just a leave pass to actually shut down empathy anyway. Well, caring about others is answered in terms of human rights. I can answer it in terms of theology too. The same outcome is that there is a denial of my humanity if I close myself off, if I don't empathise and imagine what it would be like to have been born there. We don't choose the stage of life we're thrown up on. We don't choose our parents. It's the lottery of latitude, really. And empathy says, what would that be? What would that be like? Well, when we think of the globalised world and international conflict, there's another self-interest reason to actually respond. And that is that the world is a waterbed. You press down in one place, it comes up in another. Whether it's climate change, whether it's conflict, whether it's 65 million displaced people. By 2050, predicted to be 250 million displaced people. This means there's no drawbridge to pull up in Australia and say, we're an island nation continent, not our problem. The world is a waterbed. These problems will disturb us and arise here. We know the refugees are victims of instability. We know that if you don't deal with that instability, groups such as ISIS are born out of instability. We know that after the Second World War, when there was slightly more displaced people, there was both the empathy and the imagination for the world to say, let's come together and let's settle this, and they did. What we're lacking at the moment is that leadership to say, if we act together, we can deal with this. We know that Australia, sadly, has been at the forefront, in my view, of undermining the UN Convention on Refugees, fragmenting it, casting doubt on it, giving ourselves special leave passes. That's caught on, by the way. People from Oban in Hungary, and he had to settle in Hungary 1100. That was all Hungary's quota, and he actually took up the language that we really pioneered here, the language refugee equals terrorist. And he ran around in Hungary making that link. Donald Trump was actually staggered in his conversation with Turnbull how brutal we are. He thought, wow, I wish I could do what you're doing. You do that. You lock them up like that. Even if they're a Nobel Prize winner, they wouldn't get into Australia. Well, I think we've got to recognise that Australia can't see itself as some ocean liner sailing in troubled seas, just pushing away boats, saying not our problem. I'm quite struck how the word boat people has really dominated the debate in Australia. I spoke at the Palm Sunday rally, and there was an English friend out from London. He, as we were walking to her, kept saying, you're not allowed to say boat people, are you? Don't mention boat people. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, we all know in Britain that Australians go hysterical with the word boat. They go into meltdown. I thought, it's interesting how the adjective boat people has actually overwhelmed the noun people. Boat people has become terrorist, illegal, invisible, not our responsibility. At this level, this overwhelming of what would have been a more sunny, optimistic view of Australians is quite extraordinary in the language that has become acceptable, and we know from polling is, in terms of harshness, welcomed by Australians. We know that when you play that card, it works. It's almost a holy grail in electoral politics. Hanson running at near 10%, and now she's kissed and made up with her mentor Tony Abbott, launching her book. Where is this going to lead? This is going to be yet another play in this next election with, of course, the coalition government competing for those Hanson voters with, I think, much harsher language. I personally think this has damaged the Aussie soul. A paralysing, toxic debate for 15 years has damaged the Australian soul in terms of why we care. It's not always been this way, by the way. I came across words from Sir Robert Menzies where he actually talked in a very different vein. And those words I just can't find at the moment. But if I do find them, I'll read those words to you. But what we certainly know is that Australia likes to say, because we have a little niche onshore resettlement program, only about 10 countries do it, and we're relatively generous, not even first in that, Canada is, that we like to say we're most generous. 84% of the world's displaced refugee population are in the poorest nations, not Australia, not the rich nations. On a gross national income basis, we come in about 48th. On a population basis, about 95th. When we hear, oh, we're so generous, picking out resettlement, a small niche program, there is this fake news, this counter story to actually make us feel good. Go and read Ross Gittins in The Age today. He's reflecting on the cricketers, but he says, why, when we look in the mirror and are shocked that our cricketers behave like this, haven't we seen how the rest of the world actually sees Australians? He goes to refugees. He goes to a whole lot of how our international image has been profoundly damaged by the toxic, paralysing debate. Well, when I think about other countries, I think about Uganda. I was in the north of Uganda, where 1 million South Sudanese have fled. And there, they haven't closed the borders. There, they give every South Sudanese refugee 30 by 30 metres of land. It's not really good land, but it's land. They let them go to these Ugandan schools and health clinics, as poor and overrun as they are. Northern Uganda, overrun by the Lord's Resistance Army for 20 years, is way behind the rest of Uganda just because of the trauma. And agencies like Brett and I have worked for, World Vision and many others, help them try and get a living and keep the food pipelines until they hopefully can grow some goods. When I asked the Ugandan authorities why they haven't closed the border, imagine 1 million refugees coming into Australia in the last year, what we do. They say this: we were once refugees under Idi Amin. Now that's the empathy. That is the empathy. We were once refugees. This is something that goes to why we should care, why we need to say this is part of our responsibility and our problem. Oh, here it is, Robert Menzies. Robert Menzies gave this speech at the opening of World Refugee Year in Australia in 1959. Now our global reputation for being the toughest on asylum seekers has trashed this reputation. But he said this: it is a good thing that Australia should have earned a reputation for a sensitive understanding of the problems of people in other lands, that we should not come to be regarded as people who are detached from the miseries of the world. I know that we will not come to be so regarded, for I believe that there are no people anywhere with warmer hearts and more generous impulses. That's a conservative leader. This doesn't go to left or right. This goes to going deeper into empathy. It was a conservative leader, David Cameron, who famously, under pressure to cut aid, Britain's aid is at 0.7%. That's our international promise. Ours at 0.22. Under pressure, spend it on the problems in Britain. They have a public debt of 85%. Ours is 20%, public being government debt. So they had a much bigger budget deficit and crisis than we ever had. He said, as a Conservative leader, I won't balance the books on the backs of the poor. That's empathy. He was joined, of course, with Labor, who then they legislated 0.7%. That's the empathy that Australians once had with a Conservative leader, Robert Menzies. We will not come to be so regarded, detached from the miseries of the world. Well, it seems to me that we have become so detached and so regarded internationally. And I think the work you do is in this course, while you're here tonight, is incredibly important work. We're going to need every one of you. The failure of imagination to actually deal with this at a global leadership level means we're going to need you working on these issues. And it works. We retrofitted, earthquake-proofed 160 schools before the 2015 Nepal earthquake. Just one example of many that we do. Not one of those 160 schools collapsed or had damage or any loss of life. Some 6,000 Nepalese schools collapsed with so many deaths and disaster. This course, this prevention, this way of responding absolutely works, which is why I'm really glad to be here supporting MoD tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be here tonight and for opening things up for us, Tim. And thankfully you've focused on some of the issues. You've mentioned some of the issues that I wanted to talk about tonight as well. I've been asked to paint a bit of a picture for you about the sort of global scale of the issue, and Tim has covered some of those aspects off as well. There's a couple of other areas that I wouldn't mind just presenting in this, and it comes in the context of that concept of a wicked problem. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that concept. It was a concept developed in the US in the 70s, I think, by some urban planners who were grappling with the issue around homelessness and environmental challenges and so forth. And the term wicked problem was coined in that context. Now, some of the features of a wicked problem, which, with Tim's words still ringing in your ears, you can contemplate, is that there's no you can't get agreement on the causes of the problem. Equally, it's difficult to get agreement on the best way to respond to those problems. Other features of a wicked problem is that there's in fact no way to solve those problems. What we're confronted with is better ways of managing them, which will be, I think, obvious in the context of the work that is being discussed tonight. It's difficult for people like myself or in the caring professions or people who care in general to deal with that question of you may not have a solution, you may just be grappling with the best way to manage it. Because the other way to phrase that, which is very confronting, is that you're often trying to deal with the least harmful way of doing it, which means in some way, shape or form, there is some harm that some people are suffering. And that's very difficult. The other feature of a wicked problem, and there are several others, but given the time constraints tonight, the other feature of it is that the only way you can really address wicked problems and manage them better is through very high levels of collaboration between government, non-government, civil society and the private sectors. They are in fact impossible to deal with if NGOs are the only ones trying to deal with it, if governments on their own are trying to deal with it, and so forth. Those notions and that concept of a wicked problem applies very much so to this situation here, and throws up incredible sort of moral and ethical challenges when we come to dealing with the complexity of it. And those moral and ethical challenges often feel completely overwhelming. And to give you a sense of why they can feel overwhelming, let me just talk a little bit about the global scale. These figures vary and they change quite quickly, but being able to monitor the exact numbers at any given point in time is difficult for any international agency. So there is I think you talked earlier about 68 million refugees or people who are displaced in the world today. That's probably about right, and it fluctuates depending on which point in time you're looking at the numbers. But that accounts for about 1 in every 113 people on Earth. And if you put all of them together into one country, they would constitute the 21st largest country in the world. That's an extraordinary image to conjure up in your mind. The other of that number of displaced people, about 22 million are designated as refugees. So they're people who are already outside of their country of origin and who have been found to be refugees. And half of them are under the age of 18. Now that figure is a 41% increase for that age group since 2014 alone. So over that short period of time, there's been a 41% increase of people under the age of 18 who have become displaced and refugees. 45% approximately of refugees live in what UNHCR define as a protracted situation. So a protracted situation is one in which 25,000 people or more, 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or more in any given country of asylum. There are currently about 33 such protracted refugee situations. In 1994, when we first started talking about it like this, the average duration for a person to be in a protracted situation was about 9 years. The average duration at present is about 23 years. So there are generations of people being born. There was a recent UN report that stated in some refugee protracted situations, a third generation of children have been born into displacement. And so when you think about that concept and you try to contemplate why people continue to move or why people take awful risks with people smugglers in order to find some sense of security and long-term hope for themselves and their families, just those sorts of figures on their own make a lot of sense and shine a strong light on that. In that context, Tim mentioned countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, they house about 5.7 million refugees and displaced people. In East Africa, the figure's about 3.8 million. Tim talked about Uganda, which I actually would encourage people to read about because it's an incredible story given the relative wealth of that country compared to other Western developed nations. In Lebanon, they have the equivalent of just over 25%, 1/4 of their population are refugees who have fled the war in Syria and Iraq. And Turkey houses 3.2 million. Jordan, I can't give you the figure off the top of my head, but many, many refugees as well. So Tim's point is right. On a global scale, the largest burden in terms of responding to displaced people and refugees is shouldered by developing countries who have perhaps in one respect the least amount of resources or capacity to respond, but nevertheless find ways to do that. In that context, Tim mentioned resettlement as a niche program and so forth, and it is. But I want to take this issue up in this context. Of that total number of people who are refugees, the number of places available for resettlement in developed countries for the past 20 years has hovered around about 100,000 places. In 2015 and 16, it jumped up with one-off responses like Australia's additional 12,000 people from Syria and Iraq. Canada took about 45,000 people and so forth. It jumped up to about 180,000 places. But by and large, the average has been 100,000. And with the wonderful Donald Trump, he's just cut the US program, which was about 90,000 of those places in half. When you take those figures, though, even if we were able to retain it at 100,000 places globally as resettlement, it would still take us about 20 years to resettle all those people. And so the notion that resettlement is going to provide an answer in the context of this wicked problem is false. However, it does provide a hugely strategic opportunity for us to help alleviate pressure, coming back to that concept of a wicked problem, to help manage the issue better. And if I give you an example of that, and this is where, by the way, I always agree with everything Tim says. So, the complexity of this is that the way in which you talk about different aspects of it can make it sound as though you're disagreeing with another presentation of issues. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if the EU had the same per capita program as Australia, let alone Canada, in terms of our humanitarian quotas, their quota for resettlement would be about 380,000 places per annum. Now imagine if the EU, over the past 5 years, say, in response to the Syrian and Iraqi conflict, had a quota of that size, even a bit less. The ability for them to design a mechanism to manage those flows could have been dramatically better. And instead of responding in crisis all of the time, they could have been able to relieve pressure in Lebanon so that Lebanon didn't seal its borders and leave people stuck on the other side in the middle of conflicts, and the same with Turkey. The EU-Turkey deal, which I understand has been a spectacular failure, and Brett might be able to give us a bit more on that. One of the reasons why it's a spectacular failure, because there was meant to be a clear commitment from Europe that anybody that actually went back to Lebanon or Turkey there would be very substantial resettlement out of those countries in recognition of it, and that didn't happen. You talked, I think, about Hungary. I think Poland said, the EU said, Germany and countries said, everybody should take a number. Poland said 0 is a number, and that's how many we're going to take. And so we run into these global challenges on how we deal with these sorts of issues, for which resettlement isn't an answer. But responsibility sharing is a critical tool for managing this, alleviating pressure from countries who are least prepared to be able to shoulder this burden in other ways. This responsibility in other ways is a really critical aspect for us to contemplate. And I think if countries like Australia or the EU do not want flows into their countries to be managed by people smugglers who don't care, by and large, about the well-being of the people they're moving, and that's evidenced by the warehouses full of bodies of people they couldn't move in in Libya. It's evidenced by the mass graves in the Malaysia, Thailand borders. It's evidenced by all sorts of different things. Hundreds and hundreds of people put on boats that were never, or rafts that were never designed to carry that many without any life jackets or anything like that. But we understand, if you think about the sorts of figures that we've just talked about and the issues Tim was making, you can understand why people are still feeling compelled to take those risks. And the challenge for governments around the world isn't that they should have to accept people smuggling being the means through which refugees can seek and find protection, but instead of complaining about that, putting in place credible measures and systems regionally and globally that means they will take responsibility for managing this issue themselves rather than ignoring that issue. And that's an area where particularly Western developed nations are failing abysmally at present. I was recently in Germany at a conference discussing integration challenges, and it was a UNHCR conference with governments and NGOs talking about the challenges of how do we successfully integrate people. Why is that an important issue? Germany received, when Angela Merkel said, "Come and we will protect you," they got about 1.5 million in 18 months. I don't think they will ever do that again, by the way, because it's generated enormous political instability. It took 4 months to establish a government. The far right did extraordinarily well in the polls off the back of that, as we saw in Italy, as we saw in France, as we've seen in Denmark and the Netherlands. So I think those issues, they won't respond to that sort of a crisis in the future. But what was really interesting for me, being in a country like Germany, which has incredible capability, was that they're now confronted with the challenge of how do we integrate people successfully? How do we manage this issue so that it doesn't become one that generates more political unrest or feeds into the far right? Now, I don't know what the answer is for Germany, but I know this. They are one of the most powerful countries in the world, and in the EU, they are probably the most powerful country. If they can make this work, then what that models for other countries in Europe and around the world is fundamentally important, and their ability to influence and encourage other countries like the UK, France and others to do more than they currently do would be greatly enhanced. The flip side of that is if it doesn't work, the likelihood is that those other countries will run a million miles away from this, fortress themselves even more, and that will compel people to find even more, take even greater risks in order to achieve the protection and the safety that they need. So this question of dealing with a wicked problem on a global scale with these sorts of figures is phenomenally challenging and confronting. Tim touched on the fact that the quality of debate and the discussion around this stuff is sometimes terrible, and I find it at times repugnant and almost sickening. The extent to which this discussion has become a binary debate about who's right or who's wrong, about the absolutes at the far end of each spectrum of it, of this question is well, apart from being very depressing, offers no hope whatsoever for us to find sensible compromises that can help us manage this wicked problem much better. Until everybody is prepared to lift themselves out of their ideological entrenchment or their political opportunism or ignorance in general, until we're able to lift ourselves out of that and contemplate the possibility that just because someone may have a different view to our own doesn't necessarily make them a simpleton or a bastard. That if we can just find a way to talk to each other about this issue where we can examine all of the facts, even if they confront previously held views that we might have wanted to hold on to, shaped our identity about over years, or whatever the case may be. That willingness, that preparedness to have that discussion is, in my view, the only way we'll ever get out of this. And I hope that in the future we will find leadership in government around the world, in the international agencies around the world, in the non-government sector and in the private sector that will value that type of engagement, that type of analysis and conversation above the sort of stuff that we've been getting for the last, more than 15 years. So thanks very much, and hopefully we can talk about that a bit more tonight.
Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you to the Dean, to Dr. Esther Charlesworth, Dr. Judy Rogers, and the entire team behind MoDDD for inviting me here this evening. And thanks also to my esteemed previous speakers for spelling out an issue with great eloquence and depth. I'll fill in a few of the spaces now really with some examples of what's it like working in country. And Esther said to me, just talk about what you do on a daily basis. And I said, I don't know how interesting that is, but at least I'll try and give some examples. So I'll go over a few of the global figures and what we're kind of looking at, and then really just dive in deep and explain a bit about what I was doing last month in Bangladesh. So as both Paris and Tim referred to, we're really in the midst of a global crisis, unparalleled in history. Of course, some of these figures are really hard to keep monitoring and updated. But at the moment, it's at least the mid-60s, maybe the high 60s in terms of million displaced globally. That's a mixture. Now, we discussed this with the students yesterday of IDPs, refugees and others. Now, these might just sound like terms, but really in the end, it's quite important because it's a different legal status. And in the end, that determines what kind of project you can get and what kind of funding goes to you. When you're an IDP, that's an internally displaced person. That means you're a citizen of your country, but you've been forcibly moved to a different location against your will. When you're a refugee, you're outside your country and you are at the behest of the International Refugee Protection System, which is administered by UNHCR globally. Now, in my job, I deal with all the shelter and settlement of people in that category. So we have many millions. It says 21.3 there, but a lot of those people are under the direct mandate of UNRWA, United Nations Relief Works Agency, who take care of all the Palestinian refugees, which are not under the mandate of UNHCR. So to add a few more numbers and figures, really what we're looking at the moment is 26 years of displacement until there's some kind of durable solution, which is the terminology that most people in UNHCR use in every sentence, durable solution. At the moment, there aren't that many durable solutions. Paris mentioned that. For me and for my job, I have a team of about 200 or so built environment professionals, collectively referred to as. People come from a background as architects and engineers and other kinds of allied disciplines, and really work in doing shelter projects and camp planning projects. Now, we often start off looking at emergency camps, but in the end, the average duration is around 26 years. So, referring back to what Esther mentioned, I'm not the biggest urban planner in the world. My team do the work. But we're building new towns. We call them camps, but they're new towns. So how do we do that better? And that's one of the wicked problems that we often confront with on a daily basis. Top hosting countries there, and I have not included Bangladesh because I'll come to that point later. Unfortunately, when you're in Bangladesh, because the government is quite strict in how they use the terminology, they haven't accepted them as refugees, haven't accepted the Rohingyas as refugees. So unfortunately, when you're in a meeting with the RRC, which is the Refugee Coordination Authority in Bangladesh, they're referred to in meetings as undocumented Myanmar nationals. You're not allowed to use the term refugee. So there's a lot of meaning and ammunition that goes behind terminology and language, and it mightn't seem much when we're talking about it in a context of free speech here tonight, but it's very loaded in many contexts. There's a few graphics and maps, and I'd be remiss amongst an audience of architects not to use graphics and maps and pictures of buildings, and I'll get more into that. And it really just kind of locates the problem there geographically, and in terms of representing both host countries and also the countries from where most refugees come from globally. Now, of course, those that take on the impact of supporting that refugee caseload are generally the neighbouring countries. And most of those countries are also often affected by the crisis which is causing the displacement in the first place. So what does it look like? I mean, now that we have most refugees not living in camps, they actually live in urban areas. And this is a picture of Lebanon, but it could be many cities in the Middle East. And what does it look like to be in a multi-storey, dense urban setting? And how do we really reach people in that context? What's the role for architects and others? Who owns those buildings? And even when you're displaced in, say, Syria, if you're used to live in the 7th floor of an apartment block in Homs or Aleppo and that's destroyed, who's going to rebuild it for you when you rented it from someone else and they bought it from a developer? So really, that's our wicked problem as architects. How do we work in that context? We have a lot of student projects where they're proposing a brand new kind of plastic blow-up design that you can place in the field, but really that's not where refugees are anymore. So we have to think of the context and really the politics within which we work. These are typical kind of rural camps. This is Azrak in the bottom, and I think that is Kaba Bay in northern Kenya in the top. We've got around, it says 225, but there's actually 420. It's hard to quantify how many refugee camps there are in the world, because we have a methodology in UNHCR where we say, okay, anything that is designed and managed by UNHCR, we'll call it a refugee settlement. Anything that's spontaneously formed by a group of people fleeing violence or persecution who decide to coalesce in a certain geographic area, yes, it's a camp, but unless it's officially kind of registered or operated or managed by one of the agencies, it often doesn't come into the data. So it's really hard to work out exactly how many camps there are globally. So how do we kind of deal with the issue from the perspective of a practitioner? Really, we look at a planning process and we kind of develop some strategic objectives around that. Really, for us, it is an architectural issue, but it's really more of a planning issue to try to look at harm minimisation and try and look at how we can create spaces and places that really reduce violence and maximise social cohesion. The example before that Tim gave of Uganda is a really good example. There's an enabling political environment in Uganda and in many other countries now where they actually want refugees because they see the economic stimulus which hosting refugees promotes. And really that's part of what we're dealing with. Dealing with these issues of empathy is partly about changing the narrative, because there's a lot of fallacies and a lot of falsehoods. It doesn't cost, in net terms, it does not cost a country money to host a refugee. They bring more than they take. There's ample evidence around that. And really, for us as practitioners, how do we work with providing resources, not just for the refugees, but also for host communities? Because in the end, in most countries in the world that are hosting refugees, it's the host communities that actually are often just as poor off and under-resourced. And that's a development issue. So we're looking at a humanitarian crisis, but what is really the root cause in many ways is decades and decades of underdevelopment, chronic lack of governance, and a real kind of social and economic crisis which causes people to flee, and those that host them are often in fairly similar circumstances. So this is an aerial photo using the drone of one of my staff in Kutupalong. This is now the biggest refugee camp in the world. And it's very interesting that it sprung up in really a matter of months. So this is on the eastern border of, I've got a pointer here, I don't think I have. But you can see the small inset down the bottom left. It's on the border of Myanmar, in the southeastern part of Bangladesh. And you probably remember various media reports of refugees fleeing from August last year. And that hasn't stopped. It's not on the news anymore, but it's still happening on a daily basis. I think 8,000 arrived last week. In the beginning, a lot of people arrived with machete wounds, bullets embedded in them. Around 10 to 12,000 people died on the way. They were shot and chopped up and murdered and assaulted by the Myanmar authorities. And now the Bangladeshi government has also closed the border to a degree, so a lot of people are stuck in a no man's land. UNHCR and other agencies, we go to the border and work in those areas and try to really see what we can do where people can't go back to the place they've fled from and can't really enter further into the country they want to go to. You'll see the general numbers there, and then the kind of the pinkish blob in the top, that's expanded here, and that's the Kutupalong camp. So I'll just show another few images of that area. You can see the figures here. Really, from August there was 212,000, and by the end of the year there was 900,000. So it was really a very rapid exodus from Myanmar. Now, of course, responding in any context is very, very tough. It's even harder when everyone is congested into one location and the arrival is very rapid. So the chaos that kind of comes with that is really quite hard for all agencies, not just UNHCR, to deal with. This is an aerial photograph, and before that, it was pretty much jungle. Now, people self-settled, and they self-settled in the most precarious of landscapes. And really, in terms of risk, we would quantify this as saying it's a multi-hazard environment prone to flooding, cyclone, landslides, and now more than ever with the deforestation that's gone on, because the absorptive capacity of the land to take up, torrential monsoon rains for days and weeks and months on end is really severely curtailed. These are some photographs that were taken toward the end of the last rainy season when people were crossing the border. And it's pretty severe, and people are really taking everything they can, including their goat and whatever else they can to survive. And it's tough, and people are dying on the way, and it's still happening today, and it'll happen tomorrow. So when people can't get any further, they really just try to get to the dry land they can. So what do we do about it? And if you were all there working in my team, what would you be doing about it? And this is the kind of work you'd be doing. We have a relationship with UNISAT, and we download satellite imagery, and we pay for that, and then we do detailed mapping of flood risk areas and landslide areas. And we try to plan out how we can deal with the landscape and try to provide a minimum safe dwelling. Now, we're not even meeting the minimum humanitarian standards. There's not enough water, not enough health provision, and not enough shelter to meet what we call the sphere standards, which are really the basic parameter by which you measure the effectiveness of humanitarian intervention. So we're not there. We're trying though. Really, this is where people are living and the hazards that they're confronting. So I'll just go back one step. On the left-hand side, this is really the overview of all the flood risk mapping for Kutupalong, where there's about 720,000 people. This is how it looks like close up. So we send our teams out to each zone and each block, and we physically mark each building that is prone to flooding or landslide. And then we are now working out specific messaging and evacuation procedures per family. Now we're trying to work out where they go, because if the government isn't providing more land, what do you say to people? You can't really give clear messaging when there's not much more than saying, get ready because it's coming. But we are doing things. We're distributing shelter upgrade kits to 80,000 families within 6 weeks. We've got mobilised hundreds and hundreds of people on the ground to do that, partner agencies, including World Vision, Save the Children, Oxfam Care, like a lot of the main NGOs, plus a lot of local NGOs in Bangladesh as well, and also the refugees themselves. We mobilise thousands and thousands of people every day to build roads. They've hand-built, I think, 6 kilometres of road in the last couple of weeks, and we give a daily payment for that. We're pre-positioning 800,000 pieces of bamboo, and of course you might think, okay, well that's really good, but there's a huge environmental impact for that, because most of it's being harvested from around Chittagong hill tracts. We've got in a market chain analysis to look at how can we get sustainable building materials in place really quickly and still give some kind of local microeconomic benefit to the building material suppliers around in Cox's Bazar. So that's another kind of element of the wicked problems we're dealing with. But there's some good quality work going on. As I mentioned, upgrades to around 80,000 shelters are going on at the moment, the paving of the roads and building of a lot of bridges. There was only 1 or 2 in the beginning, and people were wading across filthy sewage polluted water, but we've built dozens, if not hundreds, of bridges now, and most of the refugees are building the bridges themselves because they're fairly tough rural stock, the Rohingya. They're mostly paddy farmers, and They've been building their own buildings and working on the land for years. So really it's just about the provision of basic tools and materials, and most people can build for themselves, and they're doing a really good job. We're building dams here and there as well, and putting water purification equipment as well. But you can see the really horrific effect on the landscape and the terracing and carving away of the hills, and it's pretty obvious to everyone. It doesn't even matter if you're from a technical background or not, that the potential impact of that is really serious. The monsoon season will start in about a month, and it'll get very heavy very quickly. So there's a lot of decisions to be made around, okay, if we can't reach everybody in terms of preparedness, what can we do? And that's where the flood risk mapping and landslide mapping has come in really invaluable. And we also target people that are occupying slopes over 35% gradient. So what about people like us, and how do we relate this back to MoDD, and what kind of academic space is being carved out and should continue to be carved out? So I might just kind of refer to my notes here, and I've written a few things which I think are worthwhile considering. I mean, Bangladesh itself, the flashpoint only really happened in August last year, and as I mentioned, around 900,000 have crossed the border since then. And will this be the next protracted crisis? Is this the equivalent of Syria for Asia? Will this be the beginning of a series of political machinations and infighting within ASEAN? Is this the beginning of what really happened to the Vietnamese 30 years or more ago, with the exodus of millions of Vietnamese seeking safety in other countries, including Australia? And reflecting on what Tim said, Australia was a generous and big-hearted, open-armed country then, and Australians are. The country maybe is going through, let's say, a dark shadow at the moment, but I believe Australians are, and I know a lot of Australians after 17 years in the field that have a warmth and generosity of spirit that is needed and valuable just as much as our technical skills. I mean, will it lead to isolationism? Will it lead to further marginalisation of Muslim minorities, disinvestment, erosion of democratic, if any, equitable governance system left in Myanmar and neighbouring states? I mean, the issues are inherently political, but they have a physical manifestation, as you can clearly see, and some kind of architectural and planning response is clear and important. Really, in the end, the protection of civilians is what we're after, and there's not that much evidence of a benevolent state, and really, in the end, often the state is the perpetrator of violence, so sometimes our faith in governance systems becomes somewhat overwhelmed. But in the end, for me, this is not a story of despair or hopelessness, but it's one of challenge. And there are many stories of refugees finding brilliant and wonderful ways to survive and support themselves, of love and generosity. And, you just have to check some of the websites and you'll see it. You'll see it on the UNHCR website, and you'll speak to any refugee that you meet in Melbourne, and they have a story of success and courage. So reach out to them. In the end, for me, technically and professionally, it's a story of complexity, and are we up for the job? And do we as citizens and as professionals have the capacity to understand and find meaningful inroads into working with these global challenges? How do you work across disciplines, across architecture, across design, across social work, across health, across law, to find these hybrids using technology and the best of creative approaches to meet complex humanitarian challenges? It really is great to see education moving on in this direction, and with MoDDD being a great example of that, and RMIT being really very forward-thinking. And I have a lot to do with universities in Europe and America, and this is cutting edge and this is progressive thinking. And I love to see it come to its fruition. I mean, in the second year of the degree now. It's critical for us to be all thinking outside our own disciplines, our own boundaries, and outside our own education. outside our own comfort zones. And I mean, I think as a final word, and maybe some food for thought for all of us, is what role does habitation and shelter play in this? I mean, achieving protection, helping to sow the seeds for development outcomes. There's much to be done for displaced people around the world, and as the tragedy of global displacement continues unabated, these issues will not go away, and we have to be equipped to understand them, to rationalise them, and to be able to respond to them in a meaningful way. Hope you now have a better understanding of how kind of UNHCR works, what kind of work I'm involved with, and really also what are some of the limitations of the UN system and the humanitarian approaches in general. It is not the solution for anything, it is just one way of responding. In the end, it's active and engaged citizens that help find the answers necessary to build peace and to have the skills to work in these complex humanitarian situations. But on a personal level, I must say that it's my goal that we all have some kind of empathy and compassion, as Tim mentioned, as well as the energy and the motivation. These are the main resources that humanitarians need, actually, to build on the collective capacity to keep on responding. And in the end, let's all hope that we can work together to make sure that no one's left outside. So, thank you.
Well, now we'll just dedicate, we were running a little bit behind schedule, but maybe the next 10 or 15 minutes to a Q&A, and then we invite you to have a drink with us outside. I think a spectacular trifecta of ideas here. Tim really speaking again from the heart. Why should we care? And going back to Menzies and thinking of him as a generous person really kind of did my head in, but was provocative. Paris so carefully described the global picture, and particularly in Europe, and what a leading light Germany and Angela Merkel has been. And I think Brett brings us down to ground, particularly given this is the end of a mod intensive week for some of the students in the audience. And what are the spaces and places of refugees, and how we can forge these transdisciplinary teams to solve the wicked problems that Paris so articulately framed his lecture with. So I'm just going to, really enough from me, but I think we've got a roving microphone here. And can we have a few questions? Anybody with a question? At the front here, okay, or at the back? Yep.
Lisa Scalone, recently minted survivor of MoDDD. This is a question from a couple of us, and we've compiled it. It is acknowledged that architecture and design are integral to social fabric, as we've discussed tonight. Ai Weiwei has recently observed that we are facing a crisis of not only refugees, but of our value systems for future society. How do you believe that we can instill in designers of the future the art of listening, a sense of humanity, and that good architecture is not only about form, but more importantly, space. And that space is vital for community engagement, particularly for children who have the right to be protected and educated in these spaces, but also to play and to learn the value of humanity and empathy for the future.
Good question, Lisa. Thank you.
You an architect?
I don't know if I'm a reformed architect or a lapsed architect, but there's something still inside. That's an interesting question, Lisa, and I think I've got a couple of thoughts on a response, but it's certainly not complete. I'll bring an example up that I've mentioned to Esther before, and one issue for me is that we're all trained as architects to, take an idea from a concept right through to a built product in the end. We're producers, and we're meant to lead that process, and we're very strong on a kind of project management mentality. And I thought that that was the way that things should be done. But at one point, about 10 years ago, I was in Somalia, and I couldn't work out why what I was doing wasn't working. And in the end, I realised that people didn't want to be told what to do. They just wanted to be worked with. And they wanted to be leading a process. They wanted to be connected. And in the end, some of the best learning I've done is from people that have the ability to work with teams and are trained to work with teams. And I'm thinking of social workers, of teachers, of educators. They're used to working in groups and they don't see themselves as project managers, probably in the same way that architects are trained to. I think there's a whole new space to open up there around cross-disciplinary thinking and understanding. And it really isn't the domain of any one discipline that has the answers to these things. It's about really working responsibly and equally with each other. And my time also with World Vision, where I was part of the rapid response team for natural disaster often, and we would go in there as a team of, I was doing shelter, there was a health professional, child protection, education, water sanitation, and everyone was equal. It wasn't that one discipline had precedence over the other, and everyone had to find a way of bringing their particular skills and expertise together. I think that is still a huge amount of work to be done within academia as well, trying to find that transdisciplinary nature of really working together in that way.
I might just add that I know nothing about architecture, but knowing nothing's never stopped me pontificating before. I live in a well-designed, low-rise South Bank set of apartments, gym and pool in the middle, and the stairs, there's only 3 floors, and the sitting outside is built for community. I've never been in a place where you so naturally bump into each other, have parties at the common barbecue, see the kids playing, and it's taught me how good design is absolutely fundamental for relationship and for community. Community, I think, is, though, the big challenge if we go to values that are at the heart of your question. The real challenge, I think, at the moment is the question around human dignity. I think the whiplash effect from globalisation has seen a profound turning inwards and re-tribalising going on in the world. And by that I mean that sense of we will only look after our own. And the responsibility for those who aren't our own tribe, often I call it the old gods of blood and soil are back. The gods of blood lead to racism, the gods of soil to nationalism. Nationalism is back. Part of the problem we've always had with the international rules system is that the UN utterly depends on national sovereignty to play by the rules. And when you get re-tribalising and nationalism resurging, we're seeing the rules fragment profoundly. Well, what that leads to is that agreement the rules had around human dignity and how we are all responsible for that human dignity. So it seems to me that the conversation Paris invited us to have in this country actually is a conversation globally, that we have to hold human dignity. We have to then have built environments that reflect human dignity and community, and international rules, load sharing, not giving certain nations a leave pass, as Australia has on its aid levels. Load sharing is the only way for international rules to actually restore human dignity, and as an expression of that, absolutely the architectural built design that enhances or damages that dignity.
Sorry, I just want to jump in here. Paris, I'm interested in your work with Foundation House, and particularly survivors of torture in Australia. How important is a sense of space, place, roof overhead to reconsolidating a life or an identity?
I think it's fundamental to people's recovery. What people, and it was lovely to hear what you said then, Brett, about needing to think about people don't want things done to them, they want to be able to do things. And that's a feature of having fled a circumstance where you have very little control over your life around you. And one of the aims of persecutory regimes and torturers is to remove that sense of control and safety that you have over your lives and the lives of your family as one of the means of both diminishing you as an individual and as a person, and also being able to exercise over the longer term influence over how well your life can be lived. So any activity that helps restore that sense of balance, the sense of safety and security that they can feel, and the sense of being in control of that for the betterment, not just of themselves, but their families and the wider community, has enormous therapeutic benefits. And, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, it wasn't just because of the invitation from Esther, which was also a motivating factor, but, you know, it is so important to have people from other disciplines. I spend my life with social workers and psychologists who are all really lovely, but you wouldn't always get them to take responsibility for project managing how to rebuild a town or something like that, not if you wanted it built in a reasonable period of time. That interdisciplinary approach and thinking about how in a design context, in the context of building safety, you may not think of it as you're doing something that has therapeutic benefits or outcomes. But if it restores safety, if it restores a sense of security, if it restores dignity, if it helps people assert a level of control over their lives, then that's an extraordinary thing and a wonderful contribution to their psychological well-being. I think one of the challenges in these scenarios is there's the emergency response and there's the long-term response. And that's complicated by, in many respects, you don't want people to have to be there for a long time. You'd like them to be able to go back to their country where it's safe and so forth. But we've seen generation after generation being stuck in those situations. So there's a challenge in planning about how to think about that into the future as well.
Just two more questions, one from the front here.
Yep. Mine is much easier. For someone who hasn't been part of any degree, like Maud has done any architecture and like working as architecture, how hard it is or how possible it is to be part of organizations like UNHCR? Because I've been having problem getting in touch with this sort of organization and getting to them. So.
You and 68 million others.
Yes. Okay. I think the answer is just yes. It is a bit hard to get into the UN system, if that's the question. But I also think that it depends on really what your entry point is as well. There's an element of truth to the fact that it is a fair amount of middle-aged white men, but the reality is also that there's 98% local staff. So if you go to, for example, UNHCR Uganda, nearly everyone is Ugandan. In Kenya, they're Kenyan, and so forth. So there really is, amidst all these global problems, there is actually a really wonderful, when you look at it over a period of a couple of decades, localization and skills transfer that's gone on, and the UN has moved away from being very Western dominated to very, very, very local. In my team, I have 11 in Geneva. In UNHCR in Geneva, there's about 900, let alone all the other UN agencies. So it is a big organisation. In my team, there's, really from 10 different countries, African, Middle Eastern, Iraqi, a couple of Europeans, a couple of South Americans, I'm the only Australian. So it's a mixed bag. I think that the diversity is really valued. Language skills are valued, especially if you're. I mean, you can see from the presentation the focus of the work is really a lot these days in the Middle East and Africa. So I would, would often select staff based on their linguistic capacity as well. It's important to, if you're working in Syria, you need to speak Arabic. Also, the background, professional background, education background, have to kind of fit the current vacancies as well. So everything's online and you can scour the websites for more information.
Come to World Vision, it's much more cuddly.
Hear, hear.
Good evening. I just would like to remind that we're also facing a crisis of refugees in Latin America. So we have many Venezuelans that are fleeing the country. And that brings to my mind that even in South America, they were relatively culturally closer to each other. We're already facing cultural problems, many frictions in our countries. And in that sense, I would like to know how refugees can be explained what to expect when we are going to settle in their new country, because it looks that it's a big issue, that there's many of refugees, especially from the Middle East, that go to Europe, that face many difficulties because it looks that it's very complicated for them to be adapted to the new environment, and they have to be there anyway. So I think it would be somehow change the image, the negative image that refugees have nowadays.
Thank you for the question. I think this is an area that Australia has got enormous amount to share with the world in. Perhaps unlike some other aspects of policy, but by and large, I'm sure there have been the odd hiccup here and there. Over the last 65, 70 years, I don't think there's been a group of refugees from any country in the world, from any situation, and regardless of what they have been through, that we haven't been able to resettle in some way, shape or form, and who haven't gone on to become extraordinarily positive contributing members of the Australian community. You could leave here tonight and go down Bridge Road and have a wonderful meal at any number of Vietnamese restaurants. You can do that in all sorts of other situations. A lot of it has to do with, one of the things for a country like Australia is that we've been a country of migration. So it's having multicultural policies, or a sense of that, even with the trouble spots that exist in some attitudes around nationalism and so forth. Our experience as countries of migration have set us up well to be able to also have very effective programs for settling refugees. Canada is a country of migration. They've done that. The US, although we can have all sorts of conversations about the US at this point in time, but their history is a country of migration. Europe's not. And it's one of the reasons why they're struggling with these questions right now. And it's one of the reasons why we shouldn't necessarily be asking them to say, look at aspects of how we've been dealing with asylum seekers as a model, but we should ask them to have a look at how we settle refugees and build from that strength as opposed from the other one. One of the issues that I always say, and we talked about a wicked problem and there's no solutions and so forth, and it is really challenging. But there's one thing that we do have control over, and only one. And we have absolute control over that. And that is how well we decide to treat people. Whatever the response, however we believe we need to arrange things to respond to an international crisis or a flow of refugees or whatever the case may be. The one bit within our control is how we treat people in the situations that we establish to try to manage that situation better for them to be better. That's the bit I think internationally we've struggled with, and in many areas here and overseas are failing at. But if we look at how well we've settled people that we have chosen to bring in, because we always feel much better when we're in control of the flow, which is a problem, but that's for another discussion. There's an enormous amount to learn and an enormous amount of confidence to be taken from the fact that this isn't an issue we should be frightened of, and it's in fact an issue we can do an extraordinary amount and much, much better with.
Thank you. And I think on that note, we might need to wrap up. So can I thank Tim? Oh, sorry. I just have to do a shameless promotion before I do the thanking. For anyone interested in the Master of Disaster Design Development, we actually have a mid-year intake, which means that you need to enrol in May. And there is an information session in the same room on the 1st of May. And that's the email for the time being if anyone has questions, and tell your cousins and your aunts and whoever. I'll just go back. So I'll just go back to thanking Tim, Paris and Brett. I mean, I've heard you speak before individually, but I think, as I said, there was this sort of wonderful sense of Tim, building up the whole picture, and then ending off with Brett with the matter-of-factness of dealing with his mud flats in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to all the MoD students who are really making this event happen.